The Chinese are highly interested in our oil and gas. They have been trying to diversify for a number of years. For all the times I've been there, they've always said we'd like more of Alberta's oil, and we've always been able to have to say, well, there's really no opportunity with that. So they're incredibly excited about the fact the MOU got signed last fall.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got an explosive report for you today. You see, throughout the years, there's been multiple warnings given to Canada from American authorities, informing the Canadian government under Justin Trudeau and now under Mark Carney about the reality of China's ever-growing influence in this country, from secret Chinese police stations in Toronto and other cities to potential military bases in Prince Edward Island. And now we have reports of China's influence expanding into the Alberta oil fields. Yes, you heard that right. We now have news of some guards, alleged armed agents in northern Alberta with prohibited weapons.
Alberta's oil patch is facing a startling allegation involving armed Chinese security guards at a project near Fort McMurray. The claim has not been independently verified, but it raises immediate questions about who controls security around critical energy assets. With Mark Carney pushing deeper economic ties with China, the timing puts Alberta's oil industry under an intense new spotlight today.
Ladies and gentlemen, we got an explosive report for you today. You see, throughout the years, there's been multiple warnings given to Canada from American authorities.
The allegation itself needs to be handled carefully. There's a major difference between an eyewitness account and an established fact, and Canadians should know where that line stands. If the guards were properly licensed Canadian security personnel carrying lawful equipment, Ottawa should establish that quickly. If the weapons were prohibited or the personnel were operating outside Canadian rules, regulators need to explain how that happened at a strategically important energy facility. Either way, the responsibility sits with Canadian authorities to establish the facts. The larger concern is what this episode says about oversight as Ottawa expands commercial relationships with Beijing.
Out of Alberta, about some heavily armed guards present at an oil field site. There's a news article covering this. This is the article here. Armed agents seen at Chinese energy project in northern Alberta. The driver said 3 armed guards remained in shadowed areas.
China's interest in Canadian resources is hardly difficult to understand. China is one of the world's largest economies and one of its biggest energy consumers. Alberta, meanwhile, has enormous oil reserves and an industry that has spent years looking for better access to markets outside the United States. That creates an obvious commercial opportunity. Canadian producers want customers. China wants energy, and Ottawa wants stronger trade relationships. The problem begins when the discussion moves beyond selling commodities into foreign investment, ownership, infrastructure, technology, and strategic influence surrounding those commodities.
Based on our own observation, China needs to have more oil, and they're not getting enough of it. So right there, they are approaching.
Alberta oil has traditionally been heavily tied to the American market. That dependence has become a major political issue because Canadian producers have repeatedly faced uncertainty over access to the United States. The push toward Asian markets, therefore, makes economic sense from Alberta's perspective. New pipelines, export terminals, and stronger Pacific access could give Canadian producers another destination for crude and potentially improve their bargaining position. Carney can reasonably argue that Canada needs more trading partners. The question is whether his government is putting enough safeguards around the strategic infrastructure and companies that make diversification possible.
It's very clear that the tariffs and the anti-dumping investigation that's being imposed on our canola growers is a direct retaliation by China to the EV tariffs. Our canola growers and our producers know that.
A Chinese company buying Canadian oil is one thing. A foreign state-linked company gaining a significant financial position in the infrastructure that produces, processes, transports, or exports that oil is a different policy question. Ownership does not automatically equal control, and commercial investment does not automatically create a national security threat. Those distinctions matter. And at the same time, Canada has every reason to examine investments in sensitive sectors more carefully when they involve a major foreign power. Energy infrastructure can affect transportation, supply chains, regional economies, and national security. Ottawa cannot treat every energy investment as an ordinary business transaction.
In many ways, the communist country and the populist province are polar opposites. Yet, the relationship between the two jurisdictions has never been stronger or more important. Nowhere is that interdependency more evident than in oil and gas.
That is where Mark Carney's decisions, they deserve serious examination. His government is trying to reposition Canada economically as the country faces pressure from its traditional dependence on the United States. A closer relationship with China could become part of that strategy, particularly if Canada wants to sell more energy and critical minerals into Asian markets. Yet diversification only works if Canada controls the terms of the diversification. Alberta should not be placed in a position where its resources become increasingly connected to a foreign power through ownership structures, infrastructure investments, or supply chains that Ottawa has failed to examine properly.
Or do they set up illegal police stations in your country? Do they put bounties on your people?
That's an important one that a lot of Canadians are not aware of. There are Chinese secret, not so secret, I guess, police stations in cities like Toronto, I believe in Montreal as well.
You know, the timing just makes the issue even more important. Canada's looking for new economic relationships while Alberta is under pressure to expand its export options. And that means the province oil and other natural resources are becoming more valuable from a geopolitical perspective. Countries around the world are competing for reliable energy supplies, critical minerals, technology, and industrial capacity. Canada has those assets. Alberta has an enormous share of the energy wealth. The federal government therefore needs to think beyond the next trade announcement and consider what the country's resource strategy could look like 10 or even 20 years from now.
Because of China's large demand, large need for oil.
Alberta has huge oil sands resources, about 20%.
In the last 15 months, 3 Chinese corporations spent billions to...
Carney has talked about a changing global order in which economic integration can be used as leverage. The source material includes his warning that countries can no longer assume economic compliance with guarantee security. That argument applies to Canada itself. If Ottawa is deliberately increasing economic integration with another major power, it needs to understand where dependence could develop. A diversified customer base can make Canada stronger, while a new dependency can simply replace an old one. The objective should be flexibility, with Canadian companies able to sell to multiple markets while strategic assets remain subject to Canadian oversight.
Not just a small amount of inefficiency. Are they 9 times less efficient at their jobs? Or are they doing something else? And if it's not trade, what else are they doing here in Canada? I think it bears reminding folks that there was at least one diplomat who was from the Toronto Chinese Consulate, Zhao Wei, who was declared persona non grata in 2023 and expelled from Canada because he wasn't conducting trade. He was coordinating efforts to target one of my former parliamentary colleagues, Conservative MP Michael Chong, and his family.
Yeah, that happened in 2023. You have this so-called diplomat who was actually blackmailing a member of parliament who is of the Chinese diaspora. The guy is a Canadian, but his family came from China, and that's what those people are doing here. They got the same number of diplomats that the United States has in Canada, and yet they do 9 times less, a fraction, about 10% the amount of trade. So why the hell do we need so many Chinese diplomats here if we're not doing nearly, not even half of the amount of trade that we're doing with the Americans? That's because they're not here for trade. They're here for something else.
What are the activities of the 8 out of 9? So are they really inefficient, or are they doing something else? Those are some of the questions that I'm asking. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Cheryl.
So that is why the alleged incident near Fort McMurray deserves an official answer rather than political speculation. The question is not whether the allegation proves a Chinese plan to take Alberta's oil. It does not. There is currently no verified evidence in the material provided that Chinese personnel are attempting to seize Alberta resources. Now, the responsible question is much simpler. What happened at the site? Who were the guards? What authority did they have? What weapons were they carrying? And which Canadian agency was responsible for oversight? Those facts should be established before anyone reaches a larger conclusion.
Escorted to the unloading area and allowed to leave his truck only to untie the load. Site personnel directed the loader, which the driver said is not typical at other locations. So you have a situation where the people at the site are acting in a very strange manner.
The Fort McMurray region is not an ordinary commercial zone. It's the heart of Alberta's oil industry and one of the most economically important resource areas in Canada. Thousands of workers, major corporations, pipelines, roads, processing facilities, and supporting businesses are connected to the region. When foreign companies operate there, they're operating inside a sector with national economic importance. Security arrangements, therefore, deserve scrutiny, regardless of the nationality of the company involved. If the report is inaccurate, authorities can clear it up. If there is a regulatory problem, authorities need to address it.
China needs massive amounts of energy to fuel its crush of new vehicles and sustain its unabated economic growth. And the country is looking to Alberta's oil sands to feed its insatiable petroleum appetite.
Alberta and China are uniquely tied because of China's large demand, large need for oil.
The bigger strategic question concerns what happens when Chinese demand for Alberta oil grows at the same time as Chinese companies increase their participation in Canadian markets. A buyer relationship can be useful for Canada. A deep investment relationship requires more safeguards. Ottawa should be able to identify which Chinese companies are investing, who ultimately controls them, what assets they are acquiring, whether sensitive infrastructure is involved, and whether Canadian regulators have the ability to intervene when necessary. Those questions are especially relevant when the sector involves energy, telecommunications, critical minerals, ports, pipelines, or other infrastructure that can influence Canada's economic security.
Number of diplomats that the United States has in Canada, and yet they do 9 times less, a fraction, about 10% the amount of trade. So why the hell do we need so many Chinese diplomats here if we're not doing nearly, not even half of the amount of trade that we're doing with the Americans? That's because they're not here for trade.
There's also an Alberta question that Ottawa cannot ignore. Alberta has spent decades developing its energy sector, and the province has repeatedly argued that federal policy has limited the ability of its producers to reach markets. If the federal government now wants to use Alberta resources as the foundation of a new relationship with Asia, Albertans are entitled to ask what they receive in return. They should want more export capacity, more investment, more jobs, and stronger markets for their producers. They should also expect the federal government to protect the province's strategic interests when foreign capital enters the sector.
Don't you think that Communist Ottawa is leveraging Communist China against Alberta?
Well, this is where the Carney government's approach could face a difficult balancing act. Canada needs investment and Alberta needs export markets. China has enormous purchasing power and could become an important destination for Canadian commodities. Refusing every Chinese investment would not automatically make Canada safer or wealthier. At the same time, approving investments without serious scrutiny would be irresponsible. The policy has to distinguish between ordinary commercial activity and assets that could create long-term strategic dependence. And that requires transparent rules, strong security reviews, and enforcement that applies equally regardless of which foreign country is involved.
We need our federal government to step up and support them at this time. And I urge the federal government to get back at the table and resolve this issue immediately and provide immediate support to our growers at this time through the money they're generating off those EV tariffs.
The United States already provides a clear lesson about the danger of excessive dependence on a single market. Canada's auto industry, for example, has been described in the source material as heavily dependent on tariff-free access to the American market. Canadian vehicle production relies on access to a much larger U.S. consumer base. When that relationship becomes uncertain, investment decisions change quickly. Alberta's energy industry faces a related strategic problem. If Canada wants to reduce exposure to one dominant market, replacing that dependence with another dominant customer would only solve part of the problem.
Secondly, in petrochemicals, they have always wanted to do more business with Alberta, produce more things here for their market back there. And so we've been working with them on that as well.
That means the smartest strategy for Alberta is not choosing between Washington and Beijing. It is building enough export capacity and enough commercial relationships that no single foreign government can dictate the province's economic future. Canada needs access to the United States, stronger connections to Asia, and relationships with other major markets. Alberta producers should be able to sell their resources wherever the commercial opportunity exists, while Canadian governments retain the authority to protect critical infrastructure and prevent foreign influence from becoming excessive. The debate becomes even more important because energy is increasingly tied to national security. Oil is not simply a commodity that changes hands at a price. It powers transportation, industry, manufacturing, agriculture, and military capabilities. Countries that secure reliable energy supplies gain economic resilience. Countries that become dependent on outside suppliers or vulnerable infrastructures lose some room to maneuver. Alberta's oil, therefore, has strategic value beyond the provincial economy. Any federal policy that changes who buys it, who finances the infrastructure around it, or who operates that infrastructure should be examined through the wider lens.
Thirdly, agriculture. Canola is one product, but there are many other products that they want to buy from Canada. And with all of the uncertainty that currently resides in the world, especially the uncertainty being created by our friends down south.
Now, Carney's government now has an opportunity to really demonstrate that its China strategy is based on Canadian interests rather than political headlines. Ottawa can pursue trade while demanding transparency. It can encourage Asian investment while protecting critical infrastructure. It can expand energy exports while ensuring that foreign companies remain subject to Canadian law. Most importantly, it can explain to Albertans exactly what safeguards are being used. If the government can't answer basic questions about ownership, security, and oversight, criticism will become inevitable.
That communist Ottawa is leveraging communist China against Alberta. I mean, come on. I mean, you know, we live in the world of realpolitik.
But you don't mind being a pawn in that fight?
We're not a pawn.
The alleged armed guards should therefore be treated as a warning sign that deserves verification, not as proof of a conspiracy. There's no justification for turning on unverified report into a confirmed claim. There's also no justification for dismissing the report without checking it. The sensible response is investigation. If Canadian authorities establish that everything was lawful, they should say so. If something was wrong, they should explain what happened and what will change. That's how public confidence is protected, particularly when the incident involves a foreign-operated project in one of Canada's most important energy regions. The report from northern Alberta may prove to be a misunderstanding, a lawful security arrangement, or something that requires investigation. At this point, the evidence provided does not allow a definitive conclusion. What can be said is that Canada's resource strategy is changing, and the consequences could last for decades. Alberta's oil is becoming part of a broader contest over markets, investment, infrastructure, and economic influence. Carney's government is choosing to deepen Canada's engagement with China. That choice deserves scrutiny because the country should diversify its markets without surrendering control over the resources and infrastructure that make the diversification possible.